They called her just a passenger and laughed when she asked about the Boeing 737's emergency procedures, until both pilots collapsed from food poisoning at 35,000 feet, and everyone discovered the elderly lady was actually a retired airline captain with 30 years of commercial flying experience. Watch till the end, because what this woman did next made aviation history and saved 180 passengers. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Denver International Airport as 67-year-old Margaret Maggie Sullivan settled into seat 14A aboard United Flight 847, a Boeing 737-800, bound for Seattle. She looked like any other retired passenger traveling to visit family. Gray hair neatly styled, reading glasses perched on her nose, and a paperback novel tucked into her purse alongside prescription medications and travel documents. The flight attendants smiled politely as they served her coffee, and the young business travelers around her barely acknowledged her presence, some even making dismissive comments about elderly passengers taking up overhead bin space with their oversized carry-on bags. To everyone aboard the aircraft, she was simply another retired grandmother on a routine domestic flight, probably visiting grandchildren or attending some family gathering. The businessman in 14B had rolled his eyes when she'd asked him to help lift her bag into the overhead compartment, muttering something about old people who shouldn't travel if they can't handle their own luggage. The young woman in 14C had put on noise-canceling headphones the moment Margaret had politely asked about the safety card location, clearly wanting to avoid any conversation with the elderly passenger. What none of them knew was that Captain Margaret Sullivan had spent 32 years flying commercial aircraft for major airlines, accumulating over 18,000 flight hours in Boeing 737s, 757s, and 767s, with an impeccable safety record before retiring 3 years ago at the mandatory retirement age of 65. Her pilot certification was still current, maintained through regular proficiency checks and simulator training every 6 months. But she had deliberately chosen to keep her aviation background private during her retirement travel, preferring to enjoy the anonymity of being just another passenger rather than dealing with the constant questions and requests that came with revealing her professional background. Her career had been distinguished by numerous commendations for exceptional airmanship, including successfully landing a 737 with partial hydraulic failure in 2018, executing an emergency evacuation after an engine fire in 2019, and receiving the Master Pilot Award from the FAA for her decades of safe flying. She had been one of the first female captains hired by United Airlines in the 1990s, breaking barriers and proving herself repeatedly in an industry that had been slow to accept women in leadership positions. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Brad Morrison speaking from the flight deck. The pilot's voice came over the intercom with the confident tone of someone who'd completed this Denver to Seattle route hundreds of times. We've got beautiful weather ahead of us today with clear skies and light winds. We're expecting a smooth flight at our cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. Flight time will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes, and we should have you on the ground in Seattle right on schedule. Margaret glanced toward the cockpit door, her experienced ear automatically noting the slight tension in the captain's voice that passengers wouldn't detect, but that she recognized immediately. She'd heard that same subtle stress indicator countless times during her career. The sound of a pilot dealing with minor technical issues, weather concerns, or crew coordination problems that didn't warrant passenger announcement, but required careful attention and professional management. The Boeing 737-800 was climbing smoothly through 25,000 feet, its twin CFM56 engines producing their characteristic whine as the aircraft gained altitude toward its assigned cruise level. Margaret noted the normal sounds and vibrations that indicated a properly functioning aircraft, unconsciously monitoring the subtle changes in engine pitch and aircraft attitude that most passengers never noticed but that were second nature to someone with her background. 37 minutes into the flight, while cruising at 37,000 feet over the Rocky Mountains with Denver now far behind them, the first signs of trouble began to emerge. Margaret noticed the flight attendants huddling near the galley, their professional smiles replaced by concerned expressions as they spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Their body language indicated something more serious than routine service coordination or minor passenger issues. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Jennifer Park. A different voice came over the intercom, lacking the earlier confidence and carrying a subtle note of strain that Margaret's trained ear immediately detected. We're experiencing some minor technical issues that require our attention and may encounter slight turbulence ahead. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work through these procedures. Margaret's pilot instincts immediately activated like a switch being thrown. The switch from captain to first officer for routine passenger announcements was highly unusual and suggested the captain was dealing with something significantly more serious than minor technical issues. In her experience, such announcements typically indicated either serious mechanical problems or crew medical emergencies, both potentially catastrophic situations at cruise altitude. She quietly unbuckled her seatbelt and approached the nearest flight attendant, Linda Chen, who was serving as the senior cabin crew member for this flight. Linda was clearly agitated, checking her watch repeatedly and glancing toward the cockpit door with obvious concern. "Excuse me," Margaret said politely, using the calm, authoritative tone that had served her well during countless emergency situations. "I couldn't help but notice you seem concerned about something. Is everything all right with the flight?" Linda glanced around nervously, clearly debating how much information she should share with a passenger. The airline's standard procedures discouraged discussing operational issues with passengers, but the stress of the situation was evident in her demeanor. "I probably shouldn't say anything, ma'am, but both of our pilots are feeling ill. They think it might be food poisoning from something they ate at the crew hotel this morning before the flight." Margaret's blood ran cold as she immediately understood the implications. She'd seen this exact scenario before during her career, crew members becoming incapacitated due to food poisoning, usually from contaminated crew meals or hotel food. It was every airline's nightmare scenario, especially on a flight with no backup pilots aboard and no nearby airport suitable for emergency landing. "How ill are they?" Margaret asked quietly, keeping her voice calm to avoid alarming nearby passengers who might overhear the conversation. "Captain Morrison collapsed about 10 minutes ago and can't continue flying. He's conscious but severely nauseated and disoriented. First Officer Park is trying to maintain control of the aircraft, but she's starting to show the same symptoms and admits she's never flown as pilot in command on a 737. She's only qualified as a first officer and has never handled an emergency situation without an experienced captain." Margaret made a decision that would save 180 lives and change aviation safety protocols forever. "Linda, I need you to listen very carefully and follow my instructions exactly. I'm a retired airline captain with over 30 years of experience flying Boeing aircraft, including more than 12,000 hours specifically in the 737. I'm still current on my ATP certification and 737 type rating. You need to take me to the cockpit immediately so I can assist with this emergency." Linda stared at her in complete disbelief, struggling to process the idea that this elderly passenger who had seemed like a typical grandmother was actually a qualified airline pilot. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern and willingness to help, but airline regulations don't allow passengers in the cockpit, and I can't just—" "Linda?" Margaret interrupted with the command presence that had made her one of United's most respected captains. "My name is Captain Margaret Sullivan, retired from United Airlines, employee number 47,291. I'm still current on my ATP certification, 737 type rating, and medical certification. Check the crew database if you need verification, but we need to act immediately before First Officer Park becomes completely incapacitated and we lose control of this aircraft." The urgency in Margaret's voice, combined with her knowledge of specific aviation terminology and airline procedures, finally convinced Linda that this wasn't just a well-meaning passenger trying to help. They hurried through the cabin toward the cockpit door, with Linda using her access code to enter the flight deck while trying to maintain the appearance of normal operations to avoid panicking the passengers. The scene inside the cockpit was chaotic and alarming. Captain Morrison was slumped in his seat, pale and barely conscious, occasionally retching into an air sickness bag while trying to maintain some awareness of the aircraft's systems. First Officer Park was struggling to maintain aircraft control while fighting obvious nausea and disorientation, her hands shaking as she tried to monitor the autopilot and communicate with air traffic control. "First Officer Park, I'm Captain Margaret Sullivan, retired from United Airlines," Margaret announced as she entered the cockpit, immediately assessing the situation with the systematic approach that had been drilled into her through decades of training and experience. "I'm here to assist with this emergency and take command of the aircraft if necessary." Jennifer Park looked up with a mixture of relief and skepticism, her professional training warring with disbelief at the sight of an elderly passenger claiming to be a qualified pilot. "Ma'am, I appreciate your offer to help, but I can handle this situation. I just need to—" She suddenly lurched toward the cockpit trash bin, overcome by severe nausea that prevented her from finishing her sentence. Margaret quickly moved to the left seat, gently but firmly helping Captain Morrison out of his position while speaking in the calm, reassuring tone that had made her legendary among her former colleagues. "Jennifer, I need you to focus on coordinating with air traffic control and monitoring our navigation while I take over primary flight controls. Can you do that for me?" Park nodded weakly, grateful to have experienced help despite her confusion about this passenger's qualifications. The relief on her face was evident as she realized she wouldn't have to handle this crisis alone. Margaret settled into the captain's seat and immediately began the systematic assessment that had been ingrained in her through thousands of hours of flight experience. The autopilot was engaged in maintaining altitude and heading correctly, but she could see from the flight management system that they were still 380 miles from Seattle, with deteriorating weather conditions ahead. More concerning was the fact that both pilots were becoming increasingly incapacitated, leaving her as the only qualified person aboard to fly the aircraft. She quickly reviewed the aircraft's current configuration, fuel quantity sufficient for the flight plus reserves, all systems operating normally except for the crew medical emergency, weather radar showing some turbulence ahead but nothing severe, and navigation systems functioning properly. Her hands moved automatically across the controls as muscle memory took over, checking engine parameters, flight controls, and aircraft systems with the efficiency that came from decades of experience. Denver Center, United 847, declaring a medical emergency. Margaret transmitted over the radio with the calm professionalism that had characterized her entire career. "We have crew incapacitation and are requesting immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing." United 847, Denver Center, sane nature of emergency and souls on board. The air traffic controller responded immediately, his voice carrying the urgency that emergency declarations always triggered in the ATC system. Denver Center, United 847, has 180 souls on board with dual pilot incapacitation due to suspected food poisoning. We have assumed control under emergency authority and are requesting immediate clearance to Denver International for emergency landing. There was a significant pause on the radio as the controller processed this unprecedented situation. In his 15 years of air traffic control, he had never heard of a passenger taking control of a commercial airliner due to pilot incapacitation. United 847, understand dual pilot incapacitation, confirm you are qualified to operate the aircraft and are declaring emergency authority. Affirmative, Denver Center. This is Captain Margaret Sullivan, retired United Airlines, current ATP license number 1247859, current 737 type rating, over 18,000 hours total time with 12,000 hours in Boeing 737 aircraft. I am assuming command of this aircraft under FAR Part 91.3 Emergency Authority provisions. In the passenger cabin, word of the unprecedented situation had begun to spread among the flight attendants and some passengers who had overheard fragments of conversation. The cabin crew worked diligently to keep passengers calm, while privately marveling at the elderly woman who had suddenly emerged from seat 14A to take control of their flight. The transformation from quiet passenger to commanding pilot was so dramatic that it seemed almost surreal. Margaret's voice came over the intercom with the steady, reassuring tone that had comforted passengers during countless flights throughout her career. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sullivan speaking from the flight deck. Due to crew illness, I have assumed command of this aircraft under emergency authority. I'm a retired airline captain with extensive experience in the Boeing 737 and current qualifications to operate this aircraft safely. We are returning to Denver International Airport as a precautionary measure to ensure proper medical attention for our crew members. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all instructions from our cabin crew. I will keep you informed of our progress." The passenger cabin erupted in surprised murmurs and shocked conversations as the reality of the situation sank in. The business travelers who had ignored or dismissed the elderly passenger now stared in amazement as they realized their lives were in the hands of someone they had completely overlooked and underestimated. The businessman in 14B, who had rolled his eyes at her request for help with her luggage, now sat in stunned silence, realizing that the woman he had dismissed as a burden was actually their salvation. For the next 45 minutes, Margaret demonstrated exactly why she had been considered one of the finest pilots in commercial aviation during her career. She coordinated seamlessly with air traffic control, managed the aircraft's complex systems with the expertise that came from decades of experience, and prepared for an approach to Denver in deteriorating weather conditions, all while continuously monitoring the condition of both incapacitated pilots and maintaining communication with the cabin crew about passenger safety and the medical emergency. United 847, Denver approach, turn left heading 270, descend and maintain 16,000 feet for vectors to the ILS runway 34 right. the approach controller transmitted, beginning the process of guiding the aircraft safely back to Denver. Left 270, down to 16,000, United 847. Margaret responded with the precise phraseology that marked her as a true professional. Her hands moved smoothly across the flight controls as she disconnected the autopilot and began hand-flying the aircraft, demonstrating the stick and rudder skills that had made her reputation throughout her career. The Boeing 737 responded to her inputs like an extension of her will, the aircraft descending smoothly through the mountain turbulence while maintaining perfect course tracking toward the airport. In the right seat, First Officer Park watched in amazement as this retired captain handled the aircraft with a precision and confidence that surpassed many active pilots she had flown with. United 847, Denver Tower, you are cleared for ILS approach runway 34 right. Emergency equipment is standing by. Report the marker inbound. Denver Tower, United 847, cleared ILS 34 right, will report the marker, Margaret replied, while configuring the aircraft for approach. Her scan of the instruments was automatic and thorough, checking airspeed, altitude, heading, and approach path with the systematic precision that had kept her accident-free throughout her entire career. The approach was textbook perfect. Despite challenging crosswinds and the stress of the medical emergency, Margaret executed each phase with the smooth precision that came from thousands of similar approaches, touching down smoothly on Denver's runway with barely a bump as the main landing gear made contact with the pavement. Emergency medical teams immediately surrounded the aircraft as she taxied clear of the runway, ready to treat the incapacitated pilots. "Outstanding job, Captain," First Officer Park said with genuine admiration as Margaret completed the shutdown checklist. "I've never seen such calm control under pressure. How did you maintain such composure during this crisis?" Margaret smiled as she gathered her belongings and prepared to return to the passenger cabin. "Experience, dear. 32 years of flying teaches you that emergencies are just problems that need systematic solutions. The aircraft systems did most of the work. I just had to remember my training and apply the procedures I've practiced thousands of times." Airport officials, airline representatives, and FAA inspectors met the aircraft, amazed by the unprecedented story of the retired captain who had emerged from the passenger cabin to save her flight. Margaret's actions that day resulted in immediate changes to airline emergency procedures, including new protocols for identifying qualified pilots among passengers during crew incapacitation emergencies. The passengers disembarked with a new understanding of the remarkable woman who had been sitting quietly among them. Many stopped to thank Margaret personally, expressing amazement that someone they had barely noticed had possessed the skills to save their lives. The businessman from 14B approached with obvious embarrassment and genuine gratitude. "Captain Sullivan, I owe you a tremendous apology and my deepest thanks. I had no idea who you were, and I'm ashamed of how I dismissed you earlier. You saved all our lives today. No apology necessary," Margaret replied with the gracious smile that had made her beloved among passengers and crew throughout her career. That's the thing about experience and expertise. It doesn't always announce itself or look like what people expect. Sometimes the most capable person in the room is the one everyone assumes is least qualified to help. Margaret's emergency landing made national and international news, highlighting both the importance of maintaining aviation skills in retirement and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on their appearance, age, or apparent circumstances. Her story became a powerful reminder that competence and heroism come in many forms, and that wisdom and expertise earned through decades of experience are invaluable when crisis strikes unexpectedly. The Federal Aviation Administration later awarded Margaret a special recognition for her actions, though she maintained that she had simply done what any experienced pilot would do in similar circumstances. Her story continues to inspire both active and retired aviators worldwide, demonstrating that expertise gained over a lifetime of dedicated service never truly retires. It simply waits patiently for the moment when it's needed most, ready to emerge when lives hang in the balance.